Good evening. My name is Jason Wilkinson. Today I chose his sermon, or I'm sorry, I apologize. I chose the article by Douglas N. Winarski's article, Jonathan Edwards' Enthusiast, Radical Revivalism, and the Great Awakening in the Connecticut Valley. So Jonathan Edwards was an American theologian. His sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, also known as the Enfield Sermon, was probably his most well-known sermon, and at least became one of his most influential sermon. Again, I chose Douglas Winarski's article because of the well-known description he gives in his sermons. I know in my freshman year in college, I took a theology class in which we learned about this sermon. I remember them just describing a spider dangling over a fire. I mean, it was very descriptive. It's still, a lot of that description is still etched within my mind, and that's kind of what Jonathan Edwards was known for. He was an orator who was known for very vivid descriptions. So again, this sermon was written in a way to help the listener to visualize what he was saying, because he was trying to teach a lesson. He wanted those visualizations to stick. That being said, his sermon, especially the Enfield sermon, wasn't necessarily originally didn't necessarily take off. It was considered fairly mediocre overall sermon. Robert Lee Stewart's article, Jonathan Edwards at Enfield, the cheerfulness and pleasantness. He actually states that his sermon wasn't considered exceptional at the time. And Edwards' biographer didn't even mention his sermon even 7 years after his death. In fact, it's not until later generations where his sermon took on more meaning. The author also notes that really it was Jonathan Edwards' oratory skills. As I mentioned before, it was very vivid. He was very well a great orator and making descriptions, visual descriptions, and letting you imagine exactly what he was talking about. And that's what he was most well known for. In Winarski's article, he states that theologians and intellectual historians, by contrast, frequently have dismissed sinners altogether. And the reason they did that was because, as I mentioned, at the time, his writing just wasn't considered exceptional at that time. It's later generation where his writings really became more well known. So there is that question on how influential was the Enfield sermon actually was, especially to the Great Awakening movement. Some would argue that maybe it wasn't. It's definitely more influential for today's audiences than in the 1700s. And in Belden C. Lane's article, though, he argues, his article is titled Jonathan Edwards on Beauty, Desire, and the Sensory World. He writes that his work actually merits attention by Catholics and Protestants alike. I mean, he obviously believed that, yes, his writings were important, his teachings were important, and that Jonathan Edwards himself was an important person, that we should study him and look at the influences that he has had. But then again, you have someone like Edward G. Gallagher, who writes in his article, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, Some Unfinished Business, that one cannot help but conclude that Edwards is a causality of decentering of Puritanism and devaluing of religious writing signaled by Philip Gura over a decade ago. So he obviously he looks at a lot of the negative aspects of the influences of Jonathan Edwards. Approach. Winarski also, who tries to take a more objective approach, he talks about a lot of the influences of Jonathan Edwards, both positive and negative. Overall, I think all the articles gave some great points. I think in reality, most things are somewhere in the middle. In this case, I think he did influence, especially if you look at evangelism, and a lot of modern pastors, and even within Catholic churches, a lot of them are try to be much more descriptive, much more visually. They're trying to get the audiences more engaged. So he definitely had, at least in his theology and the way he did within the church, has definitely had a great impact. At least today it does. We see that in, for example, men like Billy Graham, televangelists. They're out there on a pulpit, large crowd, talking to a bunch to other Christian that wants to hear what they have to say. And I think they use a lot of his methods in what they preach. And that is good and bad. I think there are some individuals out there that definitely takes that to their advantage. They don't necessarily believe in what they preach, and that's an important view. They misuse that imagery for their own personal gain, and I think that's kind of what Douglas L. Winiarski's article really was trying to point out. Yeah, he has some good stuff. He has some bad stuff. Let's take a look objectively at all aspects of his sermon. And as he asked that question, was he just an enthusiast? Was this just something for himself? My personal opinion, I believe that based off some of the writings that Jonathan Edwards probably believed what he was preaching. He was this way because he wanted to give that visualization. He wanted to influence people to see his point of view and understand his point of view. I appreciate your time. Thank you. Have a good day.